Hello and welcome to our next Surviving Work conversation. And today we're going to be talking about race and racism in health and social care. And to help us think about it, we have Roger Kline and Coreen Archer, two people who've been working in the field for a very long time. They've got huge biographies, so I'm going to ask them just to introduce a bit about their work and also what drew them to this very difficult area of work. Coreen, what do you do?
What do I do? Well, I am an organisational consultant and an executive coach. So I work with organisations to help them think about problems with their structures or their individuals, and also with individuals for the same issues from their personal standpoint, trying to make a difference. Particularly, my particular interest is with young people as well. So that's what I do.
And you use psychodynamic ideas in your work, don't you?
That's right, because systems thinking and psychodynamics are at the root of the way that we think at the Institute. So recognising that what's going on under the surface is manifesting in other places. There's usually a root to everything. Nothing happens by accident. So it's about understanding what that is and trying to find it.
Yeah.
So help people unhook themselves from various behaviours or problems or attitudes that they might not even realise they have.
And Roger, just say a bit about your very different background.
I come from a left-wing Jewish background, and I think the values I learned there are probably the ones that sustained me over the past decades. So I had a career, if that's the word, as a trade union official for 25 years. And then I retired, and I now do some research, but mainly practical work around whistleblowing, bullying and race discrimination, mainly in the health service.
And I'm going to ask you a very specific question because there's been a very important development around equality in the NHS, which you've been involved in, a new standard. So perhaps you can just tell us a bit about this new standard.
Well, the evidence is now plentiful that firstly, that black and minority ethnic staff in the health service are systematically discriminated by every measure that you care to use, and secondly,
Goodness gracious.
that
We
they,
work in the field.
My goodness.
Yeah, sorry.
it's true. Literally, every time you look at something else, you think it's the same pattern. And secondly, there's an increasing body of robust research showing the links between how black and minority ethnic staff in the health service, who are almost 1 in 5 of health service workers, are treated, and the care that's provided to patients is a very close one. And although it's often correlations, they're powerful ones. So that there is now a narrative which is widely accepted, universally accepted in the health service, that discriminating against black and ethnic minority staff is bad for patient care as well as being bad for staff. So on the back of that, the NHS has adopted something which I helped to design called the NHS Workforce Race Equality Standard, which requires, as part of their NHS standard contract, all organisations who provide the NHS with services, public or private or voluntary, they must close the treatment and experience and opportunities gap between white and BME staff. They're inspected against it, and the data is going to be published on an annual basis.
My God, I feel like we need a pause just to absorb that.
And
That's
if I had time,
extraordinary.
which I don't, I would show you the first bell curve that's been produced on the data.
Tell me about bell curves.
Well, the bell curve is what it shows is, this is on one question, so there are 9 questions. So one of the questions, question 23B, from the staff survey, asks staff to say whether they believe they've been discriminated against by their managers and colleagues in the last 12 months.
Oh my God, that's such a
And-
brilliant question.
And so difficult
And
to answer.
Yeah.
you can break the answers down in all sorts of ways: men and women, disabled, non-disabled, black and white, as well as breaking it down further within, for example, different categories of BME staff. So all we're looking at is white and BME using the census categories.
Okay.
And what it shows is that on average, it's 2.5 times more likely that BME staff will report being discriminated against than all other white staff, women, disabled, etc. Although the data for disability is quite similar. But more interestingly, very significant differences between organisations. So, for example, without naming the trusts, in London, 2 huge teaching hospitals who are next to each other, similar size, similar case mix, similar communities, similar staff mix, have radically different measures. So one of them is in the bottom 10 organisations, and the other is almost in the top 10. So once that stuff comes out, which is going to, no NHS trust board wants to be in the bottom 10 of that kind of league table. So that's going to be pretty powerful stuff, particularly since the reports are going to be in part produced by the regulator, CQC. And they're going to be inspected against it. And they're actually they've already started calling meetings of BME staff where they think the data justify doing so, closed in confidence meetings to tell them what's really going on. It's quite powerful
Yes.
stuff, causing a degree of, I think I'm off a few Christmas cards.
Yeah, but you're on loads more, I'm sure, because this is very powerful stuff, isn't it? Because one of the problems with talking about race and racism within the NHS is that individuals feel very unsafe to start unpacking what's actually going on at work. It really exposes people. But by having a simple kind of matrix, tick, 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 numbers, it sort of takes the strain of having to understand racism off the individuals that are actually experiencing it into the public domain.
Absolutely. So on everything else, the NHS is led by data. You get elderly people falling out of bed at night. You look at the data. Which wards is it happening on and when? And who's on the ward when it happens? You've got an MRSA break. You look at the data. You talk to the staff, talk to the relatives, understand it. Look elsewhere in the organisation or in other organisations to discover how they've tried to deal with it, and you set up a learning loop. So the argument is, since race discrimination is bad for patient care, you have to do the same. So you start with the data, you listen to the staff, especially the BME staff. That's the start of the conversation. And for a lot of organisations, they've had to look at data that is very, very uncomfortable. If you're in an organisation where it's 4 times more likely, as it is in one big London teaching hospital, 4 times more likely that BME staff will be disciplined than white staff. You can't change those numbers without understanding why it's happening. That's the power of it. So although on the face of it, these are you have to try and improve the numbers, they're deliberately designed to be extremely difficult to game. So you have to basically do a root cause analysis in order to change them. Ditto with recruitment or with bullying, actually.
Yeah. So let's try and understand it. Let's try and unpack what's happening with all of these workplaces which are apparently racist. So let's just think about what the characteristics are of a racist workplace in health and social care. What kind of characteristics do you think we're seeing?
I think sometimes what you see is manifestations of, it's all about power often. And if you're in a leadership role, you don't understand culturally what's happening and the way people engage with you, it can be interpreted in lots of different ways. So I think that sometimes just the simple difference of those basic cultural identifiers will affect the workplace, and it's sometimes hard to identify that that's what's going on.
So there's definitely something about the way that people communicate with each other, isn't there? So, one of the problems with being in a team or a group that is having problems with racism is that it tends to shut people up, doesn't it? Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to be the person that raises it in a staff meeting. So I wonder whether there's a sort of, like, for example, a link between hierarchy and racism, do you think, in health and social care, where people can't speak freely?
Well, I think some people do speak freely. BME staff are very conscious of this all the time, but they don't talk about it at work because it's not safe to do so.
No.
Senior managers will look at a team and say, look around this room, say, this is quite a mixed group. My team work really well together. But actually, they have no idea what's going through the heads of staff. And the evidence for that is not just the staff survey returns are quite different, and the workforce data returns show there's a problem. But when you do provide a safe place for black and minority ethnic staff to speak, the conversation is entirely different to the one where people don't feel it's safe. And I can give you a number of examples where chief execs described where they've been in a meeting of black only staff where more than half the staff have been crying during the meeting as they describe what's happened to them during their careers. But people won't do that outside for all sorts of sensible, rational reasons. They may talk to it with their friends outside, but they're not going to talk to it at work. It's not safe to do so.
And also we've got this sort of very public exposure of whistleblowers, people that have raised concerns, and then it sort of spirals into whistleblowing, which is a whole seventh circle of hell for people. But people often feel they can't go back. Once you've said it, it's very hard then to go back into your teams and use that information in a constructive way.
Absolutely. And as Roger says, if you become that person, don't you? You become the whistleblower. You become the sensitive person who's always accusing other people of racism. So why would you do that? Because you're going to limit yourself. And so I can see that in a community of other professionals, you suddenly can confirm that the experience that you've had is a one of racism. Because otherwise, I think also to be successful in any organisation, that can't be your first response to every situation that happens, every problem that emerges, whether you know that it is or it isn't. You generally, that's not the way that people are thinking. You can't afford to think that way. As Roger has clearly identified.
I think once you become identified as the person who challenges race discrimination, if you're black, the response of the organisation is a very good measure of whether or not this is an organisation that is serious about tackling racism. So an organisation where racism exists but isn't talked about, raising the race card is career suicide.
Yeah, absolutely.
The only way forward is to move elsewhere. Good organisations say, well, actually, if we are not tapping into the talent of BME staff, or we're bullying BME staff 25% more than white staff are being bullied, which is what the national data shows, or it's twice as likely the BME staff won't get appointed when they're shortlisted, which is more or less what the data shows. If we can't talk about that, then we've got a serious problem in the same way as we won't talk about patient safety issues. And indeed, there's overlaps. So that with whistleblowers, it's really bad in many organisations, not all, being a whistleblower. It's even worse if you're a black whistleblower. So the proportion of BME whistleblowers who were thanked by their organisation for raising concerns last year was 3%. And by every measure, there's 8 measures for the relative treatment of BME and white whistleblowers. On every single one, the treatment of BME whistleblowers is significantly worse, with the consequence, of course, that if you're a black doctor or nurse, it will inevitably affect how likely you are to either raise a concern or admit a mistake. So there's a kind of, not only is there a parallel, there's actually an overlap between people who are seen as difficult or different or breaking the kind of unspoken codes and cultures of the organisation. And so the data is very powerful. It makes it much easier then for individuals to say, actually, what's happening to me fits in with what's happening in the organisation. You need to look at that.
And presumably that's the link then to patient care, isn't it? That as soon as mistakes can't be admitted to, clinical practice can't be looked at objectively and in your teams, then that's when accidents happen and patients...
There is a mountain of really powerful data. So, for example, there are really strong correlations. The strongest correlation in the staff survey with the data on patient experience is the data on the experience of BME staff. BME staff report they're being discriminated against. That is the most reliable measure of the culture of the organisation and the experience of all patients, not just white, not just black patients. And there's direct links between correlations, but strong ones, between how BME staff are treated, what their responses are to questions such as in the staff survey, such as do you feel career progression and promotion in this organisation is fair, and things like infection rates and mortality rates. So this is a very powerful narrative. In a way, it's an extension of the more general work of Michael West and people, which says how you treat staff is directly related to patient outcomes. I mean, he's drilled down, for example, to show that how effective teams are affects the survival rates after hip operations. It makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If the consultant's bullying the junior staff, they're less likely to say, I think you've left a pair of scissors in there. And there's a famous American patient safety expert, Robert Bartu, who says, you tell a safe team when the most junior nurse can say to the most senior consultant, I don't think you've washed your hands. And the consultant says, you're quite right, thank you. And that's not a bad measure about other things too.
So let's think about the reasons why this is happening. So, cat's out of the bag. We've got a real problem with race discrimination in health. Presumably the same figures apply to social care as well. What are the systemic reasons for that? Or what are the drivers for that, do you think?
Yeah, the thing that I'm thinking about is that it's about the issues around difference, really. Because, as you say, if the data proves that the way that black and ethnic minority staff are being treated is a good benchmark, then that is the most obvious difference.
Yeah.
So as you move through the scales and of other cultures and other markers of difference and disability, then it's easier then to say, you know, what is actually going on in the system.
Yeah.
And I think that it colours the organisation.
Yeah.
Literally.
I think there's something here because we had a very interesting conversation with Elsie Gale, who's was a midwife and a whistleblower, a black woman, and talking about bullying for us. And it was really interesting, her analysis about why she was bullied and victimised. And it wasn't just because of the colour of her skin, it was also because she's a midwife, and this is a very bullied sector. And we were thinking about the reasons why, and as good feminists we were thinking about how women and babies are treated in hospitals. But a big part of it is the way that midwives have to work, which is autonomously. And they don't easily fit into often the very strict clinical hierarchies that exist certainly in hospitals. And their allegiance and their most intimate relationship is with the mother and child that they're working with. And I think that sort of talks to this issue about difference, that, you know, essentially if we think psychoanalytically, we're all different.
Well,
and
quite.
that's why work is so hard.
Yes.
It's so hard to get on with people because we're not exactly the same. But there, as soon as one of the issues, one of your differences become a problem, you can guarantee that your other differences will also become a problem within that working culture. That was the proposal.
And it's a good way to defend against anxiety in a culture that works very much with life and death. You know,
Yes.
you don't want to face that real divide. You know, what you're doing can transform life positively and negatively. It's very anxious.
Absolutely. And it's also, because I work in mental health, and you know, there's nothing more irritating than a patient who's having a psychotic episode, who is not helping you at all deliver your targets, who is wasting time and money, who's refusing treatment. These are very difficult people to treat long term. And we work within systems that don't want to hear that.
No.
They don't want to hear, this isn't right for my patient.
Midwifery is really interesting because the data internationally is obstetricians, gynecologists and midwives work environments have the highest levels of bullying wherever you go.
Do they?
Loads of stuff from the States. Here, levels of bullying amongst midwives are the highest by occupation. I think I'm right in saying in the staff survey by profession, because
Oh, they
you
are?
can analyse it by profession as well as by ethnicity. And I suppose the second thing I would say is I think you're absolutely right about difference. And the reason I think that is if you look at the evidence around discipline, in patient safety, there's now an understanding that a blame culture is not one that helps you understand what's going on. So patient safety experts will distinguish between individual blame and systems failure. And on the whole, systems failure is more likely. I would use the extreme example of the Lufthansa pilot who crashed into the Alps. Lufthansa were not interested in whether he was to blame. Their priority was to stop it ever happening again, otherwise they'd be out of business as an airline. So in the health service, the sensible patient safety people say, it's not there should be no blame or no accountability, but the priority is to understand the systemic problems that might have led to that. If you have a blame culture, I think there's some evidence that you're more likely to blame people who are different. So in organisations where blame becomes part of the disciplinary process, we know that BME staff, for a number of well-researched reasons, are more likely to be disciplined. If you have a blame culture as well, it is even more likely, I think, that people who are different, and it isn't just would be BME people, it is more likely to be people, it might be people who are disabled, it might just be people who are assertive. It might be whistleblowers.
Might be trade unionists.
It might be trade union officials. So I think kind of understanding the intersect between blame and discrimination is really interesting. And so if you think of blame as one aspect of culture, then when you start to look at some of the other measures in the workforce standard that I mentioned, if you want to look at recruitment, then you need to look at, so what's the culture that results in unfair recruitment practices for everybody, which happen to impact even more on certain groups of people, particularly black people. And I think, that's the only way to understand it. It's also the only way to change it, is if you understand that you have to go beneath the problem. It's not what the panel does, it's everything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a foregone conclusion by the time it gets to the panel.
And I mean, not wishing to be too cynical, but I think, when we're talking about race or discrimination, it's devastating emotionally, the impact of this, because we're also talking about very fierce projections of hatred, actually. I mean, race isn't just a benign, oh, you're a bit different, I'm going to ignore you. This is a really hateful, violent, often attack on people. And I think sort of one of the problems with taking a kind of diversity exists because of the range of skin colour and gender and disabilities in the room is really dangerous. And I just think back to sort of trade union days when, women weren't very active and suddenly a lot of women came into leadership, and there was sort of huge disappointments about the quality of that leadership, quite honestly, and the ways that it didn't change the debate within organisations. So just physically having more black faces or more disabled people or more women in leadership doesn't itself resolve the problem. In fact, it can really take you back if it doesn't deliver, if the real workplace changes don't come about.
Well, you've got two sorts of diversity, haven't you? You've got acquired diversity and you've got inherent diversity. And there's quite a literature that suggests that if you want to change a board, it's not enough to put one or two people on, because there'll be immense pressures to behave like really interesting. In non-foundation trusts, there's been a significant increase last year in the number of BME people nominated for boards, put onto boards. But over the year, at the end, there were less BME people on boards than there were at the beginning. Why? The only possible explanation is that for a variety of reasons, they're uncomfortable with it. Some of it's because, unlike a lot of the white people, they don't have big incomes, so they can afford to take a day off and earn just £5,000 a year for it. But more importantly, if you're the only BME person on a board, you will inevitably either be labelled as the person we dump all the equality stuff on, or you'll be marginalised as less important without people even thinking about it. And I've talked to lots of people. It's as if quite a few people have said to me, it's as if I'm invisible in the room. So I think there's I think culture's very deep, and I think race is the most difficult. It's more difficult than any other issue. It's also the only issue nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah.
So there's been progress of sorts on women. There's been some progress around LGBT issues. There's even been some progress on disability. There's been no progress on race in the health service. None.
Wow.
Data is very clear.
It's interesting when you're talking about boards that people say they feel invisible, because I guess the other thing that could be going on is the weight of responsibility to be a mouthpiece for all the black and minority ethnic staff across the whole of the NHS or the social care system. Who wants to have that role?
And I think sort of psychodynamic ideas are really very good at dealing with the emotions of this, because black people in leadership receive this tsunami of projections from other people. And I think particularly for black women in leadership, I did a series of interviews about anger in health and social care. And I was interviewing people right up and down the food chain in health and social care and in trade unions. And the one thing that these brilliant, senior, experienced, powerful black women couldn't talk about was anger. And I was told, look, by a close friend of mine who worked in education as a trades unionist, who'd been racially discriminated against her whole career, she just said, look, the one thing, this is like the yes-no game, the one thing that I can't do is get angry in front of people. Not because I'm any angrier than anybody else, but the experience for other people of me as a black woman who has been discriminated against, getting physically angry and showing that emotion in the room is devastating for all of us. She said, and I just don't think I could live with it.
You don't even have to go as far as anger. If you just have a little bit of passion, then that's how it's interpreted.
Yep.
So you do mute yourself in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
The other side of it is what the Americans call weathering. There's this kind of, you know how stone drops over years will sort of wear stone away.
Quite familiar with that.
there's a very good American researcher called Geronimus, and another guy called David Williams, who've done a load of work showing the incremental impact of small measures of discrimination. He's even, David Williams is at Harvard, has even created a scale, which I forget what it's called, but it's something like an awareness-ometer. So as you go around, you have a raised awareness. So if you want to return clothes to a shop, you think twice about whether you want to do it on your own or you want to take somebody with you. If you want to challenge something, the risk is you fall into a stereotype. See what I mean? Look, she's losing her temper. And I think it's really interesting in the health service, despite the high rates of reported discrimination, on some other aspects of the staff survey, black staff rate the NHS better as an employer than white staff, because compared to the world outside,
That's interesting, isn't it?
it's relatively good. So they will say, their responses on questions like, are you listened to, are better on average than for white staff. Do you feel stressed at work? Their answers are better on average than white staff. And that's partly because life outside is full of so many pressures that relatively the NHS feels better. But when you ask them specifically about discrimination, the data is very clear. And they are really badly discriminated against. And I couldn't understand that at first, but actually it makes sense.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I don't know if you use the work of Thackeray Davids, who talks about the internal racist.
Yeah.
He's a psychoanalytic writer. And I mean, this is difficult stuff to talk about. I use it a lot with working with people who've been bullied, whatever the colour of their skin. And there is something that happens very powerfully which silences us when we're being bullied, for example, or if somebody's racially discriminating against us. Because what it does is it latches onto an internal voice which becomes complicit in this. So you see it a lot, I call it the internal bully. And I mean, clearly somebody saying that you're worth less because of the colour of your skin is incorrect. But it has an incredible power when that external voice latches into an internal voice of inadequacy one way or the other, or self-consciousness, or not accepting your own difference, or not accepting yourself somehow. So it's a very powerful mechanism that's involved, and we can talk about it on a rational level, which I think is important. We can think about it on a sort of, statistical level, but there's also a very important sort of psychological pull and dynamic that happens when somebody's in a situation of bullying and racism, which I've always found the sort of psychoanalytic ideas very helpful in understanding that, because it's a source of enormous shame for people to get caught up in a situation where they're being abused. It's very shaming.
But that makes sense of why people who are being bullied eventually start to believe, well, maybe it's me. So it's very common with whistleblowers that once the retaliation takes the form of bullying, they start to think, well, maybe I'm not such a good worker after all. Even though all their previous records will show, generally, that in fact they're exemplary employees, which is probably why they became a whistleblower, because they wouldn't tolerate poor practice. I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence that's the case.
I'm just curious about thinking about the internal racist or internal bully, just how many black and minority ethnic people are told as they grow up that actually to achieve anything you have to be better than everyone else. So then for someone to come directly and challenge you and say, actually, you're not better, then that voice is already in there that you've got to be better.
That's right. And I should imagine it's made even worse in health and social care, where we're compulsively compassionate. We've got super egos the size of tanks, which are always telling us we have to be brilliant, we're on it, we can't make mistakes, love the world.
Exactly.
So I think that's what I call mine Mother Teresa. No offence against Catholics, but my internal Mother Teresa, which is a really sadistic internal voice, which we all have, which says, yeah, you could have done better.
Interesting. Another piece of evidence in the health service, anyway. There's data that shows that on average, BME staff who go for jobs are better qualified than white staff because
There you go.
I'm going to
Made my
quote you all
point.
over.
I've made my point.
they've tried to make up for the fact, in order to try and make it a more level playing field, you have people on band 6 and 7 with MBAs who say, I can't get a job, I've got an MBA. Well, actually, the MBA isn't the way to get the job. You've only done the MBA to some degree because you know you're good. You weren't recognised in the way that other people were recognised. So you think, right, I'll go and do another qualification.
Yeah,
But actually, the reason you didn't get the job is you weren't part of the club.
yeah.
And no number of qualifications will get you into the club until the rules of the club change.
Yeah, gosh, that really breaks my heart. I teach in MAs in business schools a lot to NHS managers, and the black women HR managers that we have know more than me. They are superb. I can't understand. I mean, I'm grateful that they're there. You know, joy to teach, but they already know it. Now,
Yes.
we need to move on. I'm going to ask you both a question. My final questions are going to be...
That's a way of saying we haven't answered any of the questions.
No, it's been
Exactly.
an utter pleasure. But I would like you to answer. So you can choose. You can answer both these questions or just one of them. But I want to know your advice for either an individual or an organisation about how to overcome racism. You can answer it on an individual or an organisational level. I'm interested in your experience also of organisations or teams or parts of organisations that have managed to turn it around.
Oh dear.
I know.
Gosh.
I know.
That's a question, isn't it?
It gets harder, by the way. My final question's even harder.
Oh, flipping heck. I think I might have to come back to this.
Yes.
But on an individual level, I think the way to defend against racism is to trust your instincts and to recognise that what is happening is actually happening. Because, you know, you disbelieve yourself because you think, surely this isn't what is happening. And then try to find a safe way to start to expose it. You have to recognising that it's risky. It's always risky because the fear is that you're not going to be believed. But I think to believe yourself is a good starting point. That something is actually happening, going on.
And maybe sort of in that, you know, if you can't do that for yourself, calling on the people that you can, you know, people that you trust. You may not love them or even like them sometimes, but people that can remind you.
Yeah, people who you trust to tell you the truth, because some people obviously are looking for, will, you know, feed into any kind of drama that's going on. So, but people who you trust to tell you the truth, that, you know, what you're saying doesn't feel right.
Yeah. And what do you think organisationally, Roger?
I think organisations have to do what they would do with any other challenge. They have to start with what's happening. And what's happening is partly the data, it's partly listening, creating spaces for staff to be able to say what's happening, recognising that staff will be rightly nervous, particularly as individuals, talking about these things. So in the guidance around the workforce race equality standard, there is an expectation that all employers will have in place a BME staff group, and that a senior person will listen to them, because that's an attempt to create a safer place, preferably with a board member as the sponsor of it. That doesn't necessarily help you in individual situations. I think in individual situations you have to, first of all, you have to find people you can talk about it, which might be outside work, but might not be inside work. So a good trade union official, when someone rings up, if you were to ring me up, and you describe what was happening, I would automatically say, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you black? Because I would assume that there's a possibility that you are, because of what you are describing. And my next question will be, are there other people having the same experience? Because I would find it much easier to challenge that
Yeah.
if there is either in existence or if I could bring together a group of people. Same on bullying, because then it's not just your word
No.
against Liz.
Yes.
There's actually a number of people saying, this is what's happened. If you have a number of people saying, well, this is how it feels, we might be wrong, but this is how it feels, and by the way, that's what your data shows,
Yes.
then suddenly the discussion becomes not you having to prove you've been discriminated against or bullied, but the organisation having to demonstrate that isn't what's happened. And that's also the legal position. So for organisations, I mean, and there's powerful evidence on this. Quick little puff. If you look at the British Medical Journal 2 weeks ago, we have an article on what works internationally around equality. And what works is where leaderships of organisations are held to account against measurable outcomes. So if you want to tackle bullying, there's all sorts of things you can do, but they largely won't work unless the chief executive of the organisation says, this has got to happen, and I'm going to demonstrate it by starting with our executive team. And in organisations where that's happened, it makes a really big difference. In organisations where it doesn't happen, there's a big teaching hospital in London which has recently been lambasted for bullying culture. They put in place a significant bullying programme. But the trouble is, the senior leadership of the organisation haven't demonstrably gone through it themselves. So my concern would be, this is not going to work because no one's going to take it seriously. Because the reason people in the health service largely bully is because there's pressure of targets, models of behaviour that become the accepted norm within the organisation. So what's the point of putting middle managers on training about how to stop behaving in bullying ways if the people at the top are still picking up the phone and saying, I'm not interested in the reason, just do it. So I think, we should be driven by the evidence of what works, as we would with any other healthcare issue. What works is, what does the data show? Other leadership demonstrating by their own actions that they're serious about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that all bullies automatically get punished. It does mean that there probably will need to be some salutary action that says we are serious about this. It's important, again, because bullying impacts on patient safety. I mean, there's loads of evidence, particularly from the States, interestingly not from the UK, about the impact of what the Americans call disruptive behaviours on team working. The biggest single cause of medicine mistakes, operating in the wrong place, are bad teamwork.
But we know why it comes from America, because it's monetized. Because, of course, it's a litigious culture. So, of course, you can actually calculate the risk. So the risk is calculated in very sort of clear financial terms in the States. I suppose that's what's happening now in this process of collecting this data is, again, we can be a bit cynical about it, but the risk management, the business case for dealing with racism, it's now we've got the data, we can start to put money behind it about how much it actually costs an institution not to address this.
So, for example,
unfortunately is the language that needs to be used.
But it's not interesting the language that's driving the people who are leading it.
No, I think
so,
that's right.
The NHS chief executive and the chief executive of the CQC, right, the two people who have made this possible, are both actually driven by values.
Yes.
And interestingly, some of the organisations that have made most progress on race equality have not done it by primarily focusing on race. They've done it by saying, right, we're going to have values of respect and collegiality in this organisation, and we're going to enforce them. And one of those is you will not treat people less favourably because they are black or gay or disabled. And so kind of values-driven approach has been quite effective. It's not that you don't have to address the issue of race, but it's kind of said, actually, this is for everybody. and in particular, we've got some issues to raise here. Rather than we've got to do something about the position of black people as the beginning. It's quite interesting. I think both work.
And I also think it's interesting coming from you in conversation between us as trades unionists who are very cynical about the word leadership, frankly. But actually, this is the true meaning of ethical leadership, and this is the value of it. So I'm going to stop it now. I'm going to ask you one final question, which
also means we haven't answered.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of other things to do.
you're detaining. You are a true trade union determined to have an argument.
I'm just trying to get a grip on it. I want to make sure I'm running the show here.
Are we passing? Are we failing? What's going on?
Very well.
And another thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, suddenly back in the 70s. My final question is about what keeps you working in this field, because we're laughing about it, and actually we're having in ways a very optimistic and positive time in our work, because there's a real interest, and crisis has brought about a real momentum around these issues. For years and years we've been talking about this stuff, and people have sort of backed away, and you never got invited to any parties. But my question is just simply, what keeps you going? What keeps you going working in this field?
I think we should go with you first.
Go you first.
Yes.
I think I'll blame my parents.
You can do that. We're in the Tavistock. You can do that.
I mean, they had very deep ethical values. Yeah, they were communists. They were very conscious of anti-Semitism. And in their own ways, they were very generous to other people and very optimistic. And I suppose that's kind of rubbed off on me, really. So, I mean, even at school. So I was a bit of a hard nut at school, but I was the one who stood up to the bullies who were bullying other people. Yeah. Quite regularly. So I was in the rugby team. I was, and in a way, that's part of. I'm not saying that's the only thing, but that's probably the most powerful. Compounded by the fact that my children are now mixed race, and I've seen what's happened to my wife, who has had to battle through all the sorts of things we've been talking to, because she came to this country as a teenager from South Africa and is now a nurse. Wow. So that kind of compounded it, but I think the origins lie much, much earlier.
Wonderful. And what about you, Coreen?
About me? Something similar in a way. I grew up in a family that had strong values as well. And I think that's rubbed off on me. I believe that we owe the world something, that it doesn't owe me something. And so that's the way I kind of move around in it. And I also think that you can't make a difference from the outside, so you've got to be in it to make a difference. And when you help somebody to recognise that what's happening to them isn't their fault, and you see that weight lift off them, the transformation is so powerful. How could you not want to continue to work in that way, even though it drives me bonkers sometimes? It's about you try and change lives with the work that you do, with the work that I do. That's why I believe in it.
And it's very rewarding when you help people.
Yeah,
and it's successful.
Absolutely.
And surprisingly, a number of times it is.
So many people just need to be heard, and so you can listen.
Thank you very, very much, you two.